everyone, and welcome back to another episode of House to Home. This is a podcast brought to you by Family Policy Alliance Foundation. My name is Grace Youngson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Joseph Kohm. And we are so excited to be back again. This episode, I suppose, is not such an exciting topic, but I think it's a very important topic. And we're actually going to be tackling the issue of assisted suicide. Joseph, would you tell us a bit more and also just give the audience a little heads up on what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, Grace, as you said, we're going to talk about the issue of what we would call or term assisted suicide. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's been called euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide. We'll be referring to it by what we think is the most semantically accurate term, which is assisted suicide. That said, we want to give our audience a heads up at the outset that this is a very heavy issue. We are not going to get into graphic physiological detail, but this is a very emotionally weighty topic. And we know that we're fortunate enough to have a lot of parents that listen in to us. So if you're listening and you have little ears around, this is just our friendly warning to you that if you want to wait till they're not around, now is a good time to press pause. Our other heads up at the outset of the show is that this is a very weighty and in-depth issue. There are a lot of depths of this issue to plumb, and we just simply cannot do that in one episode of this program. So this episode is going to give you mainly a legislative overview over some of the movement on specific policies on this issue over the last year or so, and give you some awareness of some big news on it. And then we're just going to talk about some basic spiritual principles for how to think about this issue. So that sound good, Grace? Should we get into it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. So let's start with the legislative update. So there's no way to understate that this is a rising issue. It's always been an issue as part of Family Policy Alliance Foundation's issue area or set of portfolios. If you go to our website, you'll be able to see it in our issues list. So we've always worked on it, but there's definitely been a surge in it. And there are many reasons for that. I can speculate on them later. But we're definitely witnessing a really tragic increase in this legislation across the United States, but also really across the world in some really key democratic countries and institutions. So I want to give us a general update here for the Americas first, for the United States. Our northern neighbors, Canada, have had a law like this that allows for physician-assisted suicide in effect for several years. And our Canadian friends will tell you it's been devastating to their healthcare system and to the overall just moral and mental health of their country. And there's an effort to bring that here to America. So at least one state has adopted it this year. Tragically, that was the state of Delaware. Signed it into law a couple weeks ago. At the time of recording, we're recording about mid-July here. And this was followed by the state of New York, my home state, I'm sorry to say, passed a version of this law as well. New York's legislative session rules are very unique, and we won't get into the details about them, but the law has passed both of their chambers, and we don't really know if and when Governor Hochul will sign the law. But I think it should be at least encouraging at the outset to our audience that there is some still, even after passage from the New York legislature, there's still some hesitation. This is not an all-out cheerleader perspective on this law, even in a place like New York. So that's at least encouraging. There are also 4 states where the assisted suicide bills have been introduced, but it really didn't get any traction going. And then another 11 states actually defeated versions of this law, states like Nevada and Illinois, which should be really encouraging to people in that even here in America and in the post-Roe versus Wade world, there is still a lot of trepidation about this bill. And then there are some other active efforts that our great family policy counselors are helping to fight off, like in Connecticut. I want to give a big shout out to them. New Hampshire as well. I've seen this issue come up in a different form. But the other big piece of news we want to cover is, sorry to bookend this section, Grace, with some tragedy coming out of your own home country. But the big piece of news that's had an impact on this issue area worldwide is that the UK's Parliament did pass a version of this bill a couple weeks ago. It's actually while I was vacationing there in London, the day after I arrived, the House of Commons voted to pass a version of this bill, which was really tragic because a few days before they had also voted to remove all criminal provisions in their code regarding abortion. So there's no longer really any serious restrictions on abortion. in the UK as well. So in the same week, they both opened up the culture of death at the beginning of life and opened it up at the end. I want to give some encouragement to people who are listening who care about issues in the UK, or any UK listeners we have, and that the bill does still have to go back to the House of Lords, where they, from my understanding, limited parliamentary understanding, they could bog it down for some time. They could make some changes because it is a poorly drafted bill. Like most of these bills, they are very poorly drafted. But it was a tragic week in Parliament. The week I showed up, they passed both those laws, and as people know, the UK is still a very influential country for democracies worldwide. So I want to make our audience aware of that and just know that. So just to finish this legislative update session on some kind of piece of good news, to let everyone know the debate is still very hot over this issue area around the world. A group of disability advocacy organizations in Colorado just sued the state of Colorado for their assisted suicide law, stating that it discriminates against the disabled and is therefore unconstitutional. And so I say that because FPAF is based in Colorado, but also because it's revealing that there's so many shoes still to drop with this. This is not a done and dusted, majority decided political position or moral position in America or in the Western world. And I just want to leave our audience with that to conclude this update section of the show, which is your voice can still make a difference in this. This coin is very much in the air, and where it lands could depend a lot on the work people like FPAF do and what you do in your own life. So, Grace, now that I've given you that 10,000-foot view over the legislative side, just what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the idea of assisted suicide, it really communicates this message of hopelessness. It normalizes the idea of giving up and telling someone, especially your doctor, telling you that, if you're someone struggling with your mental health, for instance, telling you that your only option is death or it's your best option is pretty horrific. And I think that the messaging that it sends is so incredibly sad. And then on the other side of it, for people who are struggling to feel guilty that they should commit suicide to take a burden off of other people, that again is extremely sad and is the complete opposite of what we believe as Christians, that, Jesus preached this message of hope and of redemption, not of loss and giving up. And so I think that this is extremely anti-God. I mean, of course, it's anti-God's creation, and, we don't have the right to take our own lives. But also, I think that it's anti-God from the perspective of just the broader message that it communicates. So to me, it's an extremely sad thing. I think it is a reflection of an extremely broken culture, and a culture that ultimately needs Jesus.
Yeah, that's well said, Grace. I was thinking something similar in my own personal quiet time this morning. I was reading a book about spiritual leadership. And one of the characteristics that's repeated about spiritual leaders throughout the Bible, particularly in the New Testament when we're talking about church leaders, is reasonable optimism. Because the whole point of the gospel message is one of optimism, that all injustice will be set right one day, that everything will be made whole and everything sad will come untrue. And we should expect our leaders to have that. And so in preparing for this show, thinking about that in my mind just reminded me of the deep cynicism behind the culture of death, like the worldview behind open policies like open-ended abortion or assisted suicide is one of extreme cynicism. It continues to tell people you can't have it all, or that if you're afflicted in some way, your life is not worth living. And to me, it's something that my pastor repeatedly preaches on, and I really appreciate him for this because he's the only preacher I've ever heard preach on it from this angle, which is the sin of overfamiliarity. I think we're overfamiliar with life, and we've come to devalue it in that way. This policy is the sin of overfamiliarity made law. I think about when I was in an earlier part of my life when I was studying to become an officer in the U.S. Army. One of the surprising things I learned when I was studying the leadership in World War II, people like General Eisenhower, General Patton, and General Montgomery, is that they actually really struggled for years to get the main body troops in their units to actually squeeze the trigger on their weapons when they had Germans in their sights. And the reasoning behind this was because this generation of young men, mostly, there were women too, but mostly young men at that time, were raised to value human life, to the point where even when a German soldier, in some distance away, was actively trying to kill them, there was still a blockage in their minds where they can get that soldier in their sights and they still struggle to pull the trigger. Now, obviously, war is an awful thing, and it's another mark of human sin. But the point is, that's the level of value of human life that generation had. And here we are about a little less than 100 years later, where a generation is coming up at about the same time. And we are so over familiar with human life and death, frankly, that it's caused us to devalue human life like this. I mean, it's shocking to me. And the last thing I'll add is just the great contrast back then that made the discovery of the German crimes in the Holocaust so shocking is how little they valued life. That was the great contrast. Is you have pictures of people like General Eisenhower and his men standing over the graves at the Holocaust sites, trying to rationalize this. Like, how do the two of us exist in the same world? And I think our culture is at an apex point where we almost have to choose between those two in terms of how we value life. And that's what I was struck with in just thinking about this morning, is how far we've come, but how much time we still have to turn back to the right direction.
Yeah, wow. I think it's so powerful what you just said about overfamiliarity, because I think that, what's interesting is we're seeing this in the UK, in the US, both two countries with amazing quality of healthcare. Around the world, there doesn't exist the same quality of healthcare as there does. And it's interesting to me that it's like, wow, we're saying to people, oh, we can't do anything better for you. It's better for you to die. We could actually provide way more, but we've become so, like, smaller issues in life are now bigger issues to us. And on the mental health side of things, it's like, oh, I'm having a bad mental health day because of something a little bit more silly, and it's because it's glorified in our culture. I mean, even thinking about the whole body image thing, one of the reasons that assisted suicide bills have been put forward sometimes, or have been justified, or even girls who have been taken advantage of with this, is like body image issues that girls have struggled with. And that, overall, in the grand scheme of life, is not like a big deal. Most girls who really struggle with that, it's like, oh, I just feel like I'm 5 pounds too heavy or something. It's not like a big deal. Your life is not over. But because of the way our culture is, we value people maybe based on appearance more than we should. Now that feels like a bigger issue. And we've become the things in life which are truly beautiful, the fact that we can have full mobility and get outside and see the sun shining and all these things, are now so overfamiliar that we feel like our life is horrible. And I think that's so sad. And this whole messaging is such a disservice to the beauty of life itself. And I think what's also interesting, as you talked about World War II, is this issue and issues similar to this are never just that issue by itself. They affect the way you see everything. If you start justifying that this person should die or, commit suicide because they have a mental health issue, why can't this other person over here who also has a mental health issue just commit suicide? Like, it starts devaluing every single person's life. And it's the same with abortion. When you don't have an understanding of the value of life, kind of nothing has value. And I think that's an extremely dangerous path to go down. That's the kind of thinking that leads to the Holocaust. That's the kind of thinking that leads to, mass devastation. And that's the kind of thing that we want to guard against by speaking against this kind of ideology.
Yeah, I think that's well said too, Grace. Because there's a lot of uncertainty in this issue area, particularly in the medical side of things. And we've talked before in this program how most people like their doctors for good reason. The doctor is someone in your life you're supposed to like. That's why we want to be careful when it comes to the medical science, because neither you and I are medical professionals, though we've consulted many in our work with FBAF. But just for the purpose of this program, we want to be humble in that. Which is why I say there's a lot of uncertainty. But there is one thing that is certain, that is an expression of that cynicism that we've at least seen in our northern neighbors, which has the quote unquote right to die eventually, inevitably, always becomes the duty to die. In your healthcare system, the messaging that comes to people who are considering this becomes, your life isn't worth it because you're dealing with a certain level of pain. You're a drain on the system. The world would be better off without you. These are all the talking points, the messaging that makes its way to these people who are already vulnerable because of their pain. And that's what causes them more often than not to choose these sorts of things. So in the guise of giving dignity to this, you're actually robbing them of agency and of the value that God says each person has by bearing his image. So I think I'd like to just finish this section, Grace, with a quote that while I was in the UK reading up on this vote, I came across this quote from one of their campaigners that I thought was really powerful. Because right now, the UK's is not having enough babies to meet their replacement rate for their population. For the record, neither is the US. It's not quite as bad, but we're not. It's dramatically, it's a demographic crisis, frankly, in the United Kingdom and in most of Europe. So this campaigner said, we need more children and better care for the elderly, or palliative care. Parliament this week voted for the opposite. They voted for less babies by taking the restrictions off abortion, and they voted for, instead of better care for the elderly who deserve it, they voted to just enable them to be euthanized. And I think that summed up the situation really well, and where the vacuum is in the UK is, who's going to step into that vacuum of cynicism and provide a message of optimism. We have to trust God with that and just try to keep our audience informed. So I think with that, we'll go to a break and come back and talk about some of the spiritual questions surrounding this issue.
We believe you were born for such a time as this. Our ministry exists to empower you to understand your identity in Christ, discover your gifts and calling through intentional discipleship, and to launch you out as a leader in your community. We're not just here to talk about faith, we're here to live it out. That means engaging culture. That means leading with truth. And yes, that means stepping into spaces that shape our world, including government. Whether you're an artist, an entrepreneur, a teacher, a nurse, or anything in between, government affects your life. Policies and laws shape the culture you work in, the freedoms you have, and the values that get promoted. That's why it's not enough to sit on the sidelines. We need young Christians running for office, serving on school boards, working in public policy, and voting with a biblical worldview. We need you to care. Because as Proverbs 29:2 says, when godly people lead, the people rejoice. This generation has the passion, the voice, the boldness. Now it's time to match that with truth, discipleship, and purpose. So here's the call. Pray, vote, engage. Be disciples, be leaders. Let's raise up next-gen leaders who carry Christ into culture and shape the future of our nation, starting with you. Join the movement of 1630 and lead the change.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That is a quote from the poem Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. And you may have heard it in the movie Interstellar. I think that is super powerful in relation to what we're talking about, and just reminds us once again of the value of life. So, Joseph, are we going to get into what the other side would say? We always like to give them a voice in this podcast. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on the argument that this is actually dying with dignity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the probably the primary talking point we hear from proponents of assisted suicide, especially in the policy side, is this is about death with dignity. This is about attaching some sort of dignity to death. And while I think this talking point is very misguided and usually used and employed in an unintentionally deceitful way, what I do appreciate is that it at least includes a notion of dignity. Because as you read beautifully in that poem, Grace, what Dylan Thomas highlights is the innate human condition of raging against death, of rebelling against it. And the reason for that is because death is not something human beings were ever created to experience. If you read the Genesis account, it's clear that death has no place in the world that God created. The existence of death itself is a result of humanity's sin, of the fall of mankind. And so that's why that's the only part of this talking point that I appreciate. But in the end, it's still misdirected, because if that's true, as we as Christians believe that death is not something we were created to experience, then there is no possible way it can ever be dignified. And that's why, frankly, I think a lot of this talking point is given by people who sadly don't have much experience with death. I want to be careful with that, because a lot of the people on both sides of this debate do have people that faced very challenging medical situations, and that's led them to fall on either side of this issue. But I know for a fact a lot of the people that do put forward this talking point in favor of these policies do not have much experience with death. And I'm not saying I have a ton of experience with it, but I have some. And I can tell you, no matter how dignified you think you can make death, the reality is if you've watched a person die, there is no such thing as dignity in death. And frankly, there shouldn't be. Like we've said, it wasn't something we were created to experience. And that was part of the point of the gospel, is the wages of sin is death. And Jesus Christ came to rescue us from the wages of our sin by taking the death we should have endured, so that we could have the life he deserved for the way he lived. The only perfect, sinless person to ever live. So the gospel message says we're free from death, yes, and that means death's power is kind of neutered for the Christian. It means you can threaten us with death, but what is that going to do? Like, this world is temporary anyways. We're all only here for a brief amount of time, and then we're going to go be with Jesus, however we die. So I find that talking point, that's why I call it misleading, because it implies that you can have dignity in death. And there really isn't. There are certainly noble ways to die. I'll finish this response with this. C.S. Lewis famously wrote in the final episode of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Battle, he wrote, remember that all worlds come to an end, and that noble death is a treasure that no one is too poor to buy. But even then, there's a difference between nobility and dignity. And Lewis's point is that whether the place you live in has an assisted suicide law or not, nobility in death is not how you die, it's how you face death. And Christians face it with the knowledge of Christ and what he's done to defeat death for us. So that's why, at least there's people of faith, that talking point really doesn't hold any value, is misguided for the people who haven't experienced that gospel message yet.
I love what you said about, dignity in death is not about how you die, but how you face it. And I think that all of that comes back to that attitude again. Are you giving up, or are you facing this with courage and this confident peace and trust in your Savior, which is really the only true freeing way to face death. But I think the other thing that sprung to mind when we were talking about so-called dignity in death is, I was reading through some pointers that you had actually sent me before the show, and there was a study, and we can link this below, done on palliative care doctors, and the vast majority of them were against assisted suicide. These are doctors who see people in these kinds of scenarios on the daily, and they did not think that this was necessary for their so-called dignity. These are doctors who care about these people. I mean, to work in that kind of setting must be extremely difficult. I know I would have such a hard time working in that. And these doctors must have such deep care for these patients to be able to work in that. And then they are saying, we just talked about earlier how neither of us are necessarily medically qualified in this area, but their voices are saying we do not need assisted suicide. And I think that's a really, really powerful testament to the fact that from someone who is very educated on this and has literally experienced and sees these people every single day, they are against legalizing this. And I think that's super powerful. I know another argument that's commonly made is that this is about a person's choice. And I think that what's interesting about that one is, first of all, it's branded in a way that actually you're being selfless if you're committing suicide. But actually, it's completely flipped on its head, because suicide is more of a selfish act. And that can be so hard to maybe wrap our minds around, because we're conditioned, or the world has tried to condition us to such a deceptive viewpoint on this. And I think that is extremely sad and is extremely satanic, the mark of Satan. He is always coming at us with guilt and shame. Jesus is always coming to us with love and telling us that we're the righteousness of God in Christ. It is not about our actions. Now, obviously, as you walk with Jesus, your actions change because you're influenced by him and you're empowered by him to live out that godly life, which is the whole point here. Is we're not hopeless, sinful people full of guilt, full of shame, better off dead, which without Jesus, we would all be better off dead. But we're not, because Jesus came and he redeemed us and he saved us. And so this whole idea of choice, when we recognize that God created us and saved us and paid the price for our lives no longer belong to us. They're actually his. And he has called every single one of us to use our lives for his glory and for his impact. And so when we just choose to end our life, we're actually also saying no to all those people that God had called us to touch with our lives. And that is something that I've thought about before. I'm like, wow, it would be so selfish of me to not follow what God has asked me to do, because there are literally other people on the other side of my obedience who God wants to touch through my obedience. And that's just such a different mindset shift to this, which is very, very self-focused.
Yeah. And it's about protecting that within yourself as well, Grace. You're right. It's others focused in terms of what, God's calling you to reach people to. But it's also God has instilled each individual person with his image. So that means you who's listening to this, thinking about, is this me? It is you. You bear the image of God, as do I, as does Grace, as does all of us. And that means we have duties to others, but also to ourselves. We have a duty to steward the image of God within us, which is why the Bible says, you're not your own anymore. You were bought with a price. As if God didn't already have claim to ownership over you by creating you. He definitely does by redeeming your body and soul at the cross. As part of Christian eschatology, which is just a big word to mean what the next life is going to look like. And in that life, we will all have what the Bible calls resurrection bodies. Jesus already has his because he's been raised from the dead. So your physical body and the pain you do or do not face matters. And you have a duty to, as Dylan Thomas said, rage against the dying of the light. Rage against the dying of God's image within you. And we do want to make room for that. It looks different for every person, but that is the obligation put on every Christian. Yes, to defend the image of God in others, defend it in yourself too. And I think there's no higher form of self-worth than that. We live in a society that is endlessly obsessed with, how do I find self-esteem? And what I think any good philosopher will tell you at the end of the day is it has to originate from outside yourself. If you can find it in the value that God places on your life, a value high enough, a love high enough that he would send his own son and watch his son suffer and die to redeem you, there is no possible source of higher self-esteem than that, which is why I think at the end of the day, everybody has to evaluate for themselves whether the claims of Christianity and Jesus are true. But I think the one thing they can't argue is they should at least want it to be true. All the implications of it are better than anything else any other worldview offers. So even if you struggle to find it convincing evidentially, you should at least want it to be true. There's no higher form of self-esteem than what's within it. So, Grace, I think we should probably sign off there. This has been a really, like we warned everybody, a heavy episode, but one we wanted to make sure we covered this summer, given all the news we went through. So thank you, everybody who stuck with us through this really heavy topic. We appreciate you listening. If you like us and you want to hear an episode from us that's more lighthearted, feel free to follow us on your podcast app. If you're on Apple Pods, hit subscribe. If you're on Spotify, please press the follow button. That really helps us. We'd love to have your followership on there so that you get every new episode delivered straight to your inbox and to your notification center. And if you like this sort of content and our analysis on it, we'd love for you to follow Family Policy Alliance Foundation on social media. Our handle is @family_policy. So thank you all for listening and for your support. I've been Joseph Kohm, as always, alongside Grace Youngson. We will see you again for another episode of House to Home next week.